Dear friends, thank you for coming. Before we begin, it is important that we acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional and unceded or unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people, who have had a continual The Abenaki people have had a continual and enduring presence here in Endakana, the Abenaki word for homeland, since time immemorial. That presence continues to this day. The indigenous people of Vermont knew this land as Wabanakik, and they are the Wabanaki people. In Abenaki, Waban is the white flickering light in the sky, and Aki means land or the earth. So the Abenaki are the people of the Dawnland. My name is Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup. I am the Executive Director of Vermont Humanities Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I would like to thank Vera Longtoe Sheehan of the Elnu Abenaki Tribe and the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association for teaching us about the importance of Indigenous land acknowledgements. Before we get started, we have many people to thank. Most importantly, Middlebury College's Engaged Listening Project, funded by the Mellon Foundation and directed by Professor Stephen Viner, and the University of Vermont's Office of the President. Without these two institutions, this event would not be possible. We welcome the new UVM president, Suresh Garamella, and his wife Lakshmi to here this evening. In addition, we offer deep gratitude to our Vermont Reads statewide sponsors, Jan Blomstrom and the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation. Our media sponsors tonight are Vermont Public Radio and Vermont PBS. Please tell your friends and neighbors that tonight's events will be rebroadcast on both stations. Look on their websites for details. And of course, we couldn't do this without our friends here at the Flynn Center for the Performing Arts. Their enthusiastic embrace of Vermont Reads March Book One has been joyful, deeply caring, and profoundly collaborative. Thank you to everyone at the Flynn.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Marie Goertz, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Flynn Center. It is such an honor and a privilege for us at the Flynn to host this incredibly meaningful event. And I thank you all for being here with us. We've been planning tonight's celebration since last fall, and we have all been eagerly awaiting this day. I'd like to offer my sincere appreciation to Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup and the entire staff and board at the Vermont Humanities Council for conceiving of this event and bringing such tremendous partners in bringing it to fruition. I'd also like to thank the Flynn's staff, board, and volunteers, and our season sponsor, Xfinity, our season hospitality partner, the Windjammer Inn, and our community ticket sponsor, Ben & Jerry's. Thank you all. If you look around the room this evening, you'll see a lot of familiar faces. There are many people here who are making a huge difference in their communities. There are a lot of people here who believe in civic engagement, in social justice and democracy. And there are a lot of people who have stepped forward and said, I myself want to serve. And there are a couple of people here tonight that we need to acknowledge by name. Senator Patrick Leahy and Representative Peter Welch are here with us tonight. Senator Bernie Sanders sends his regrets, but his colleagues, Donnie Turner and Beth Awady, are here to represent him. I know we are all wishing Senator Sanders a very speedy recovery. Please join me in thanking our congressional delegation for their lifelong support of the arts and the humanities here in this state and around our country. In addition, Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman and Attorney General T.J. Donovan and many other elected officials are also in the room. At this point, I would like to invite anyone here tonight who is currently or has previously served in any elected office to stand and please be acknowledged. From school board member to select board member to legislator, planning commission to justice of the peace, we thank you all for your commitment to your communities. Thank you so much. You make us all very proud.
Finally, in the spirit of John Lewis, the organizer, please stand up if you have ever taken a stand for something that you believe in with all your heart. Whether you stood up for your cause just once or for 1,000 causes 1,000 times, we are celebrating you tonight as well. Your work truly makes a difference, and we thank you. Please stand. We begin our evening with a short video selection from March Book 1, narrated by the incomparable Reuben Jackson.
In the fall, I started riding the bus to school, which should have been fun, but it was just another sad reminder of how different our lives were from those of white children. The county didn't bother paving roads into colored communities unless it was necessary for white traffic to pass through. Our bus itself was an old hand-me-down, just like our school books. I realized how old it was when we finally climbed onto the paved highway, the main road running east from Troy and past the white children's buses. We passed their schoolhouses as well, with nice playground equipment outside. Nothing like our cluster of small cinder block buildings with a dirt field out back for recess. We drove past prison work gangs almost every day. The prisoners were always black, as were the folks working in the fields beyond them. You couldn't help but notice. Despite everything that confronted me on the way to school, I was in heaven once I stepped inside it. I loved going to the library. It was the first time I ever saw black newspapers and magazines like Jet, Ebony, the Baltimore Afro-American, or the Chicago Defender, and I'll never forget my librarian, Corrine Harvey. My dear children, read. Read everything. But sometimes going to school was a luxury my family couldn't afford. When planting and harvesting seasons arrived, the reality of those fields displaced any dreams about the future. I'd plead with them to let me go. I'd explain how far behind I'd fall if I missed those days of classwork. We need you here, Bob. And so I'd hide. I'd get up and eat breakfast like normal. As the others made their way to the fields and the day's work, I would slip away. Bob, where are you? Then, when I could hear the approaching bus, I'd dash out, climb on, and be off. When I got home, my father would be furious. Never do it again. I did it again, and of course he would scold me again. But deep inside, I think he knew there was no stopping me. This was a life decision I had made, and it was near impossible to turn me away from it. One May morning in 1954, near the end of my freshman year of high school, I read a headline that just turned my world upside down. The U.S. Supreme Court had handed down its decision in the school desegregation case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. The doctrine of separate but equal, upon which the entire institution of segregation was based, had been ruled unconstitutional. I was so excited. Surely everything was going to change. I thought that come fall, I'd be riding a state-of-the-art bus to a state-of-the-art school, an integrated school. Not everybody was so excited. Don't get in trouble. Don't you get in the way. Then one Sunday morning in early 1955, I was listening to WRMA out of Montgomery when I heard a sermon by someone unknown to me, a young preacher from Atlanta. I didn't catch his name until the very end. Then on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. If you don't move, I'll be forced to call the police, and they will arrest you. You may do just that. My family didn't know Rosa Parks, but they knew plenty of women like her. More than a few wives and mothers from Pike County did domestic work in Montgomery. She was arrested. Montgomery was just 50 miles down the road from us. Our minister lived there. Most of my teachers were from there. So when Dr. King, as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, led a boycott of those buses, we felt like we were a part of it too. I was inspired.
I'm crying already. When we invited John Lewis and Andrew Aydin to come to Vermont, they said yes, under 3 conditions. Number 1, that they get to visit a certain ice cream company. Number 2, that they get to spend most of their time here with young people. And indeed, 2,800 middle and high school students will be with them here at the Flynn tomorrow. Number 3, that Senator Patrick Leahy be invited to introduce them. Fortunately for us, we were able to meet all 3 demands. Senator Leahy really needs no introduction, so I'm going to make it fast. He was first elected to the United States Senate in 1974, coincidentally the same year that his close friend Victor Swenson founded the Vermont Humanities Council. Senator Leahy has had a deeply distinguished career in the Senate, playing a pivotal role in many of the most important civic debates of our era. In addition to his deep commitment to Vermont and our nation, Senator Leahy also has an abiding love for comic books and public libraries, which, not coincidentally, also happen to be 2 of our favorite things. Whether you primarily watch the senator work on C-SPAN or in Batman movies, there is no denying that he is a tremendous force for good. Please welcome Senator Patrick Leahy to introduce our guests.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please. More than I deserve, but thank you. You know, Marcel and I are so happy to be here because we're welcoming our dear friend, Congressman John Lewis. Also his co-author, his collaborator, Andrew Aydin, who I understand shares my love of comic books. I mean, I can only do Batman when it comes to comic books, but they do history. And actually, that's even more important. So it's an honor to have him here. We mentioned the Vermont Humanities Council and the Flynn Center for the Performing Arts for partnering on this event. Marcel and I came to movies here and we were dating. Well, the movies were just called, I don't know if they had sound way back then, but the Council's Vermont Reads program has done so much to instill the love of reading and engage Vermonters young and old in world affairs, because reading is the important thing. Now, we've got a full house for tonight, but as you just said, we're going to have more than 2,800 middle school and high school students in this theater, and I've run into several of them here in town tonight. They're looking forward to hearing the Congressman and his co-author discuss the first book. Now, the idea for this graphic memoir was first pitched by Mr. Aydin when he was a 24-year-old staffer for John Lewis. It's a decade ago. But March Book 1 was a timely and critical selection for the 2019 Vermont Reads program. People like Catherine Patterson and others who are here tonight know how important that is. In the drawings of Nate Powell, it shows the challenges that young John Lewis faced. But let me just speak personally for a moment. He was at the center of some of the most treasured moments I've had while serving in the Senate. I stood with him on the Capitol steps during our fight to renew the Voting Rights Act. On the Judiciary Committee as chairman, I called him as the first witness before the Judiciary Committee in a hearing about the vital purposes of that law. And I tell you, that was one hearing where every single senator listened to every single word. I consider my brother and my hero. And our nation, this generation, are blessed to have him with us. I share with those memories when I walked on the floor of the United States House of Representatives where the then Speaker, not the current Speaker, but the then Speaker tried to close it down so people couldn't speak. And I was walking across the halls, and John took me by the arm and by the hand and walked me onto the floor so I could hear the discussion. All my years in the United States Senate, I remember that, and I think how fortunate people like Peter Welch are to be able to serve with him. And when a whistleblower's complaint about actions by the president came to light, everyone stopped to listen as John Lewis spoke from the well of the House to say we have to have an impeachment inquiry. Now, you know, we may not fully appreciate there are generations alive today who lived through a time when you could be barred from a hotel or a lunch counter or a polling place based on the color of your skin. As a boy, because of his color, John Lewis was not even allowed to check out a book from the library. I think of having my first library card when I was 4 years old growing up in Montpelier. That was a treasured moment. That was denied him. He's our living witness to that history, a history we can never repeat. As a regent of the Smithsonian Institution, I know how important he was as a catalyst in the creation of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I told him how proud Marcel and I were to accompany our son-in-law, who's African American, and our daughter and their children, Patrick and Sophia, going through there. He is a moral force for good in Congress, equaled by no other. Now, he calls his work building a beloved community. This is a man who's put behind him what he has, the scars from the beatings and others. He did not descend into bitterness after those beatings, that degradation. No matter how many times he was knocked down, he came back up. He came away with an undimmed faith and hope and grace and vision. But he's been a champion for everybody. Women, LGBTQ community, students who face gun violence in their schools. I like what the historian Doug Brinkley said about him. He says he's our apostle of quiet strength. That captures John Lewis. He's a hero for our time. He'll be on stage here with Andrew Aydin, and I want to ask you to please welcome my brother, Congressman John Lewis.
Hello, everybody. thank you, my friend and my brother, Senator Leahy, for those kind words of introduction. Thank you for all that you do and for all that you will continue to do. It is good to be here also with my colleague, Peter Welch. Thank you, Peter. I'm sorry that Senator Sanders could not be here tonight. But along with Andrew Aydin, we are here. Delighted and very pleased to be here to see each and every one of you. Now, I didn't grow up in a big city like Burlington. As many of you well know, I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer, living and working on another person's land. But in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4. How many of you remember when you were 4? Well, what happened to the rest of us? When I was 4 years old, my father had saved $300, and a man sold him 110 acres of land. We still own this land today. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton and corn, lots of peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. Don't tell the people in Georgia that I don't eat too many of those peanuts that we raise in Georgia today. Ate so many peanuts when I was growing up. I just don't want to see no more peanuts. Andrew Aydin, my wonderful, beloved co-writer, staffer, would tell you that if you come to our office to visit or just drop in, the first thing the staff will offer you will be some Georgia peanuts. And the staff will become so good and so smart, they learn to exchange peanuts with other staffers for candy bars and cookies. But growing up there, I tell you, as a little child, I was very nosy. Asked a lot of questions. Why this? Why that? I asked my mother, why? Why? My grandfather, my great-grandfather, why? I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting, white boys, colored boys, white girls, colored girls. And I kept on asking questions. And my mother would say, boy, that's the way it is. Don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. But one day I did hear Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on the old radio. The words of Dr. King and the action of Rosa Parks inspired me to find a way to get in the way. A way to get in trouble, what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. And I've been getting in trouble ever since. Because my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to say something, to do something. To speak up and to speak out. I remember very, very well as a young child with some of my brothers and sisters and a few of my first cousins, going down to the public library in the little town of Troy, Alabama, trying to get library card, trying to check out some books. And we were told by the librarian that the library was for whites only and not for coloreds. I never went back to that library, and to July 5th, 1998, for a book signing of my first book, Walking with the Wind. And I was given a library card. Some of you may ask, why? Why? Why would you do a comic book, a graphic novel, Andrew, or just call it a book, a little book? And Andrew came to me, and he would tell you the story, and said, Congressman, you should write a book. You tell your story. I remember reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s story, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery story. And that comic book was about, 12 pages?
16 pages.
16 pages, Andrew is correcting me. And it sold for 10 cents. That little book inspired a generation of young people to study the way of peace, the way of love, to study the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. Told us something about the teaching of Gandhi. And those of us who got involved in the sit-ins in 1960 embedded part of the essence of that book in our very souls. We start sitting in. And when we've been beaten, arrested, in jail, we didn't strike back. We didn't become bitter or hostile. And we didn't hate. For Martin Luther King Jr. would say over and over again, hate is too heavy a burden to bear. We're sitting there waiting to be served, and someone would come up and spit on us. We put a lighted cigarette out in our hair or down our backs, pour hot water, hot coffee on us. And one day we were told if we continue to sit in, it's a black and white college student and some high school student, we'll be arrested and go to jail. Now, I had never been arrested before. I've never gone to jail for anything. So I said to myself, I had what I call an executive session with myself. If I'm going to get arrested and go to jail, I want it to look clean. I want it to look fresh. I want it to look sharp. So I wanted to get a new suit, and I couldn't afford it. So I went to a used men's store in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, and bought a suit. A vest came with it. And I tell you, you should come to my office in Washington sometime. Have a large picture of being arrested. I did look clean. I looked fresh. I did look sharp. And I was telling a group of students, young students, a few days about it. They said, no, you were more than sharp. They said you were dripping. I never heard of it before. So that's a new one for me. But you know how much I paid for the suit? I paid $5 for it. If I still had it, I probably could sell it on eBay for a lot of money. The first time I got arrested, I felt free. I felt liberated. I felt like I crossed over. So during the 60s, I was arrested 40 times. And since I've been in Congress, another 5 times. My last arrest was trying to get the Speaker of the House, not the present Speaker, but another Speaker from the other side of the aisle, to bring forth a comprehensive immigration reform bill. And more than 200 citizens and about 12 members of Congress got arrested. When I see something like what we've been doing in our country during the past few weeks and months, where we are taking little children, little babies, from their mothers and fathers and placing them in cages, it makes me sick. It's not right. And history will not be kind to us as a people if we continue to let something like this happen. So March is saying, in effect, when you see something that is not right, not fair, or just, you have to make a little noise. You have to get in the way and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Just a few short years ago, when I grew up, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandfather could not register to vote simply because of the color of his skin. There were people all across the South were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. There were African-American lawyers and doctors being told they could not read or write well enough to become a registered voter. We have to change that. March, book 1 would tell you. Book 2 and book 3 would tell you that we've been involved in a long, long struggle. People died trying to exercise the right to vote. Beaten, left bloody, unconscious. On March 7, 1965, when I had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter, a group of us attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color could not register to vote. We were beaten, left bloody, and unconscious. 600 of us left church on a Sunday afternoon and marched to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion. I was leading the march with Jose Williams on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s staff. We get to the edge of the bridge. Jose Williams said, "John, can you swim?" I said, "No." I said, "Well, Jose, can you swim?" He said, "A little." I said, "Well, there's too much water there. We're not going to jump. We're going forward." And we continued to walk. And members of Alabama state troopers came and said, "This is unlawful march. Will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your homes or to your church." And Jose Williams said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." Again, he said, "Troopers advance." I said, "Major, may I have a word?" He said, "There will be no word." Again, troopers advance. You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, trampling us with horses and releasing the tear gas. I was the first person to be hit. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. My legs went from under me. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going down that bridge. I had a concussion on that bridge. And a group of young men took me back across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, back to a little church, Brown Chapel AME church that we had left from. And somehow I was able to stand up. 17 of us had been hurt. They asked me to say something, and I stood up and said something like, "I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote." The next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital, operated by a group of nuns who took care of us. The next day, Martin Luther King Jr. came to my bedside and said, "John, don't worry. I made an appeal for religious leaders to come to Selma." That following Tuesday, more than 1,000 ministers, priests, rabbis, and nuns came and marched across the bridge. That evening after the march was over, 3 young ministers went out to try to get something to eat. They were attacked, and one was so severely beaten by members of the Klan, he died about 3 days later at a hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. But at the attempted march, in the efforts on the part of these religious leaders, hastened today from the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who came forth and introduced the Voting Rights Act. And as a matter of fact, he spoke to the nation that night, and he closed that speech by saying, "And we shall overcome," using the theme song of the Civil Rights Movement. The first time an American president has said it. I was standing next to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I looked at him. Tears came down his face, and we all cried a little. So when people say nothing have changed, I feel like saying, "Come and walk in my shoes. I will show you change." Those signs are gone, and they will not return. We've come a distance, but we still have a distance to go. Today in America, there are forces trying to take us back. We've come too far, and we're not going back. We're going forward to create one America, one people, one family. In the final analysis, we all live in the same house. It doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. We're one people. And we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools. March, in the final analysis, is saying that we can create an American, we can create a nation at peace with itself, where no one is left out or left behind because of their background or the color of their skin. So I think Andrew was said to each one of us, we must come and march together. There are people trying to destroy a little piece of real estate we call earth, trying to take us back. But we all must find a way to save our country, save democracy, save our children, and create a beloved community, a beloved world. Thank you very much.
So how do you follow that? My name is Andrew Aydin, and I'm the co-author of March, and I also serve on the Congressman's staff as digital director and policy advisor. I've been on his staff for about 12 and a half years, and we've been doing these events for about 6, and it never, ever gets easier. First I want to thank Christopher Kaufman Ilstrup. I've had the opportunity to do to work with a lot of people in doing March reading programs, and this has just been incredible. I mean, I cannot thank you enough. You have done an incredible job organizing this, putting this together, helping us, and just thank you. Second, I want to thank Senator Patrick Leahy, but I have an embarrassing story to tell you about him later. So we're going to hold that one for a little bit later. Actually, it's not embarrassing for him. It was me. So how did I get here? Holy cow. I grew up in the Congressman's district. He's been my congressman since I was 3 years old. I'm not sure if that was for the congressman or for me being 3 or, I was raised by a single mom. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant. Yeah. Who left my mother when I was 3 years old. And my mother raised me by herself. If I'm totally honest, I don't think I've ever even told the congressman this before. I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm not entirely sure my father was here legally. And I was going through my mother's papers, and one of the things I found in her diary, my mother passed away about 2 years ago, and so I've been taking care of things. And one of the things that I found in her papers was that my father was arrested while she was pregnant regarding his immigration status. Just remember what those kids end up being, okay? But I was raised by a wonderful woman. I owe everything to my mother. She was a reader. She had books in the house constantly. We've talked a lot about library cards tonight, and I was fortunate enough that I was always welcome in the library. My mother was the kind of woman who had 2 library cards so that she could keep a rotating list of requests from the bestseller list to what it was, because you have a limit, right? You only get 4 or 5 per library card. That was not enough for my mother. And that's how we kept books in the house. We could never afford to buy books. But the library was our sanctuary. Later on in life, my mother joined the board of the local library. It wasn't because we had any money to give, but because my mother felt like she owed something to them. And her contribution was that she always loved plants. She loved to work in the yard. She loved to dig. She loved to get her hands dirty. And that meant I needed to too. So we would go and we would garden the library. And then my reward when it was done was that we would go in, we would pick out a new book. And so all of my life, reading has been my escape, my reward. But when your dad leaves, and nobody quite understands why, or who he was, or why your name is so hard to pronounce, and why it's different from your mom's, you start wanting to read stories about people who were doing the right thing. Stories of inspiration. Stories that give you hope. Stories of people doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And that's how I fell into comic books. Matter of fact, my first comic book was Uncanny X-Men 317. It had the lenticular cover, which the diehard nerds know what I'm talking about. My grandmother bought it for me at a Piggly Wiggly off the spinner rack in Western North Carolina. You guys have Piggly Wiggly? I've been doing this a long time. I've never gotten a cheer for Piggly Wiggly. Y'all are my people. And that's where it started. Then my grandmother realized I liked him. She started letting me read my uncle's old comic books. And I got into the Silver Age and I started reading them. Later on, as I got older, I started going to comic book conventions. You can tell I was super cool in school. And the one in Atlanta is called Dragon Con. Her, right? Dragon, yeah. Just in my defense, I got Congressman Lewis to go. Right?
Did more than once.
And my mom, bless her heart, she let me start going by myself when I was 13 years old. And I would go down there and she'd give me a cell phone. And back then, a cell phone was like this, right? So it was more of a backpack thing. And I got to meet all these creators. And I was so fascinated by them because here were people who were making a living simply with the power of their ideas, their ability to tell stories, their ability to convey feelings and emotions on the page. Whether with a pencil or a typewriter or a computer, they were able to make these things, and they made their living that way. And it seemed so noble to me, this idea that you could be self-reliant in that manner. And it shaped my youth. And I grew up, and I got a scholarship to college. I went down not too far from here to Trinity College in Connecticut. Do you have any idea how cold it is up here? What are you doing? I was coming from Georgia. I didn't have a winter coat. What I thought was a winter coat. But it was an amazing learning opportunity for me. It's what got me into politics. Because we were just down the street from the Connecticut State Capitol. And I would go down there and the way my first boss described me was as a delightful rabble-rouser. And he actually offered me a job. He was the lieutenant governor at the time. He was my professor. And so my first job out of college was special assistant to lieutenant governor of Connecticut. And I started actually the day after I graduated from college because when you're poor, there's no days off. Right? I know. And I go to my first day of work, and it's in the state capitol, and I've been interning there. I've been working on the floor of the state senate. I've been just totally amazed and loving what I'm doing, really feeling like the sense of righteous indignation that I felt watching the way my mother was treated as a single mother. That this was my opportunity to pay it forward, to help the next generation of single moms, the next generation of only children who grow up in this way. And so I go on my first day of work, and I'm so excited. And my mother and my grandparents had been in town because of the graduation. And about 15 minutes into my first day of work, my mom shows up. Just a little knock on the door. Hello. Rolls in and checks on me, makes sure I wasn't lying. I had a job. I was fine. Says, who are you? He says, I'm the lieutenant governor. And then leaves. And so that was how I started in politics. That was how I started to get here. Now, a couple years after that, I needed to get closer. My mom was getting sick. I didn't know it. And so I wanted to move closer. Mama had moved from Atlanta to Western North Carolina, to Asheville, which I've spent the last day realizing is quite similar to Burlington. I think that's why we have the Piggly Wiggly connection. And so I told my boss I was quitting. I needed to be closer to my mom. And without a job lined up, I told him I was out. And I applied for a job in Congressman Lewis's office answering his mail. I mean, it was, I think those of you who sort of understand, the mail room is kind of down here. And, but it was for John Lewis. This was my congressman since I was a kid. And I'd be able to be close to my mom and all this sort of stuff. And I applied and I got it. And I moved down to DC. And I remember starting and realizing what a sacred thing it is to answer John Lewis's mail. If you've read March Book 1 already, you know that John Lewis was able to meet Dr. King because he wrote him a letter. So when you're running that, when you're answering that mail, you don't know what each letter has the possibility of doing to the world. You don't want to tell or miss or somehow in any way abridge the potential future of some young person if they have the opportunity to get that response, that note that inspires them. And I did my best. And about a year later, the congressman got it was a primary challenge. It was 2008. It was the summer of hope and change. Barack Obama was sweeping through the Democratic primaries. And I'd been answering his mail about a year. And I started to really love it because it let me write in a way. Now, my English teachers would never have guessed that I would be on stage for my writing. But I loved writing those letters for the congressman because as a child, my mother had made me write thank you notes for everything. There's actually a postcard book out there that they've got where I wrote the essay at the beginning of it. It was the first time I'd ever gotten to tell a story of the fact that, in the South, thank you notes are serious, right? If it's not within 2 weeks, heartfelt, minimum number of sentences, and a genuine connection and an acknowledgement, then you have just screwed it all up. And that was my child. So I felt like I was getting back in. It was like I was with my family again. These were my thank you notes. I used to write with my uncle. This was a big thing. And so I did it for a year before the congressman got this primary challenge. And he asked me to come back to Atlanta and work on it with him and be the press secretary for the campaign. And so I went back home and I was really excited by this. And I just started to get to know the congressman, like really know him. I think all of y'all are probably a little surprised that he's got jokes. But what I've learned over the years is that that's how you survive. That's how you cope with violence and hatred and stress and trauma. You gotta be able to laugh at it. And that was one of the things my mom taught me. And I think very early on, to me, that was one of the things that I felt like we really enjoyed about each other. I know that's not what you expect, but it was on that campaign that I got to see this other side. And then I got to hear stories that I never heard as a child. I grew up in Atlanta. I grew up in the heart of the civil rights movement. My mother was from Atlanta. My grandmother was from Atlanta. I had heard the story of Dr. King. I'd heard the story of Rosa Parks. I'd been to the King Center a dozen times while I was in school. But on that campaign, I heard stories from John Lewis that I had never heard before. Stories of SNCC, stories of what the young people were capable of doing. The way that the Nashville sit-in movement was not adult-led. It was led by young people. The way SNCC was created by young people, maladjusted as they sometimes called them. The way the freedom rides were kept alive by the young people. The way the most important reforms of the March on Washington were brought about by the young people. The way the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the people risking their lives were the young people. And the way Selma happened because of the courage of one young person who stood up against his own organization who didn't want him to march. And nobody told me any of these stories. And so I'm thinking about this. It's coming down to the end of the campaign, and folks started talking about what they were going to do after the campaign was over. Some folks said they were going to go to the beach. Some folks said they were going to go see their parents. I said I was going to Dragon Con. And I got laughed at. But then a deep voice from the back of the room said, "Don't laugh. There's a comic book during the civil rights movement. It's called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And it was deeply influential." And I was like, "Say that again?" And I went home that night and I looked it up on the internet. It was amazing. It was 16 pages, cover to cover. It sold for 10 cents. And it was this beautiful 50s studio house style. It was an introduction to nonviolence, civil disobedience, Rosa Parks, Gandhi. And I wondered, where did this come from? How did this come about? And so I started thinking, why is there not a John Lewis comic book? And I went back to work the next day. And this was a different time. I think people now, we take for granted that everybody knows who John Lewis is. But back then, people didn't. And it was a big question on that campaign because they kept asking, well, what have you done for me lately? Like, I don't think you know what he did to begin with. And I put it out there. I was like, I think you should do a comic book. And there was this big, long, pregnant pause, right? Everybody just sort of being like, oh God, there he goes again. And even the congressman was really sweet about it when I asked him. He said, oh, well, maybe. We got enough elected officials in the room to know what that means. And look, I was 24. I didn't know any better. I didn't know what the rules were. And I just kept coming back and back and back. And for the better part of a month and a half, every time that question came up, how do we reach the young people? How do we teach the civil rights movement? I said, you need to write a comic book. And finally, the congressman turned to me, and I had no intention of writing this myself. I had never written anything longer than a tweet. No, that's true, but you know what I mean. And the congressman turned around to me finally one day. I think he'd really been thinking about it. You know, that's the kind of thing that John Lewis does, where he deep thinks. He's never going to just fly off. He's going to think about it. He's really going to let it internalize. And he turned to me one day and he said, okay, I'll do it, but only if you write it with me. And that day changed my life. Now, it's one thing to say, I'll do it. It's a whole nother to do it. No member of Congress had ever written a comic book before. I mean, you have people at the vanguard of it like Senator Leahy, but what we were talking about, the history of the civil rights movement as a comic book, this had never been attempted. And so I went back to the idea of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. And because I am a bit of a masochist, I came back from that campaign and I decided that the thing I needed to do was to go to school at night to get my grad degree. And so I started going to school at Georgetown to get a public policy degree, and they asked if I would write a thesis. You had to write a thesis to graduate, and they were like, what do you want to know about? And so I decided I wanted to write about the history of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story. Again, they're like, there he goes again with the comic books. But what we found in doing that was that there was a roadmap for us for making March. That Dr. King himself had actually helped edit that comic book. That it was used to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience in the movement by doing things like we're doing here. Going, giving talks, explaining the purpose, and having the books as a takeaway so that you can internalize and reread and pass along the comics. And so we worked. We worked for months and months and years and years. Remember, we had the idea 2008. Book 1 comes out 2013. And we had day jobs. Congressman was a congressman, is a congressman. I was his staffer, responsibilities. So we would work at night and on weekends. Sometimes he would fall asleep on the phone. Sometimes I would fall asleep on the phone. You'd just be talking, and then mid-sentence, you just hear like a snore coming in from the other. I'm just kidding, sir. You don't really snore. I know, right? And so it took us the better part of 2 years to find a publisher. Everybody said no, that would never work. And it took us 3 years to actually make it. And that was a crazy process. I mean, I don't know how to explain it. It was, well, this sums it up neatly. You guys have any recollection of the comic book hearings that Congress held in 1954, right? No, vaguely? Okay. So the gist of it is, Congress blamed juvenile delinquency on comic books. And the Judiciary Committee impaneled a subcommittee It was a select committee on juvenile delinquents, which held these crazy hearings that drove most of the people in business and comics out of business. Now, part of it was because they were antagonistic, and comic people are pretty irreverent, and so when they were called to testify, they hammed it up, and Congress does not like that. And so Congress almost destroyed comics. And so we'd worked on these books. And before book one came out, Congressman Lewis decided he was going to go to the San Diego Comic-Con. And I, being a staffer, decided I was going to go out a little bit early because you can, and because I wanted to make sure everything was okay. And the congressman had to testify in front of Senator Leahy's committee on the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. This is just after the Shelby County decision had been handed down and parts of the Voting Rights Act had been struck down. And so I'm watching, because I got to do my staffer duty, I'm watching the hearing at the convention on a live stream. And Congressman testifies, or is about to testify, and Senator Leahy is giving this wonderful introduction, and then out of nowhere, he pulls out a copy of March Book 1. In the Judiciary Committee. The same committee. And Senator, I don't know exactly where you are, but I wish you could have seen what myself and the people, the publisher, and everybody else did when we saw that happen. It was not graceful, but it was passionate. Because us on the true nerd comic side, I mean, that was the closest thing we'd ever come to healing that wound in almost 60 years. And this is before the book even came out. Nobody knew the book was any good. I mean, Senator Leahy had read it, he knew it, but nobody else did. So the look on the staffer's face behind him when he pulls out that book, I mean, it was bug eyes. Straight bug eyes. Have I gone into an alternate dimension? What is happening here, right? And I started crying. Because here I'd been fighting for years and years, and it was almost there. And I was taking a lot of flack from my colleagues who thought it wasn't the best idea. It might not be graceful for the congressman. I mean, he's dignified and important, and comics are not. At least they thought that. And that vote of support meant so much to us. And then a few weeks later, we realized exactly how big this was going to be. And I got a phone call from a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And he said, "Man, I don't usually do this, but I got an advance copy of your book. And I read it, and I loved it, and I gave it to my 9-year-old son. And I called because I wanted you to know that he read it, and then he went and put on his Sunday suit, and now he's marching around my house demanding equality for everyone." That's it, right? Imagine if we could instill a social consciousness in every 9-year-old in America. That's what March is about. You know, the Southern Poverty Law Center had a term. It's called the 9-word problem. They did a study about 7 years ago that looked at civil rights education standards in the United States. Most students graduate from high school only knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement. They know Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and that's it. And that became our mission. That became our mantra, that we were going to defeat that. And then last week, we got the results of a pretty intensive study looking at the teaching of comics, of all things, in the classroom. And they looked at the 10 most taught graphic novels in America. And they found that March was the second most taught graphic novel in America. Don't tell me things can't change. Don't tell me. So, in March, we tried very hard to put specific lessons for today's youth. They need to understand their power. They need that hope that I needed when I was a 9-year-old kid, angry that my mother was mistreated as a single parent, angry at the systemic discrimination against women in our society. And in those lessons I see today, these young people are using them. They're standing up, they're fighting back. And we're trying to point them as best we can in a helpful direction, but they're finding it their own way. Now, where do I think they should start? What's my take on this? I think they got to start with student loans. Put the story this way. Imagine if they'd had student loans during the civil rights movement. John Lewis went to American Baptist College. It cost, what, $36 a semester about, give or take? See, he's nice, he didn't correct me. Imagine if all of those young people that led the civil rights movement had, when they graduated, to pay student loan debt. John Lewis made, I think it was $10 a week as chairman of SNCC after he graduated from ABT. That's not enough money to pay your student loan debts, let alone your rent. Nobody is paying high salaries to student activists. I'll put it to you a different way. When John Lewis got married to his wife Lillian, the wedding announcement in the LA Times read, "Unemployed political activist John Lewis to wed." People who are ahead of their time pay a price, and we have to lift the burden of debt so that another generation is free to pay that price for us. I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I want to get to some questions. When I was in high school, I would bring my comic books with me to class. I'd read them in between classes. And once I got them caught out on my desk by my English teacher. She said, "You can't have those out right now. Those aren't real books." I tell you this story not as any form of comeuppance to the teacher. She was doing the Lord's work and expressing the prevailing wisdom of the time. But I got to go back to my high school. And honestly, I had a fantastic discussion with her about her experiences now teaching our graphic novels in her class. It says something about the power of an idea whose time has come and the brief period in which change is possible. So to paraphrase Dr. King, there is no sound more powerful than the marching feet of a determined people. So I ask all of you, join us and march. Thank you. You want to take some questions?
The next morning, we had breakfast together before heading as a group to meet with members of congressional leadership. No one mentioned my speech. The meetings were quick. Nothing substantive was discussed. Then we learned that the march had started without us. My God, they're going. We're supposed to be leading them. There goes America, I thought. We cleared a space to take pictures, but we were not at the front of the march. Truth be told, we couldn't even see the front. As the crowds gathered, the program began with music from some truly unbelievable performers. Mahalia Jackson, Odetta, Josh White, Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, the SNCC Freedom Singers. I spoke number 6 that day. Out of everyone who spoke at the march, I'm the only one still around. Dr. King was the day's last speaker. He started slow. I heard him speak many times. His cadence was so familiar to me. But as he found his strength, his power, he transformed the steps of the Lincoln Memorial into a modern-day pulpit. His words carried through the air like arrows, moving to a climactic refrain the world would never forget. In those moments, Dr. King made plain all of our hopes, our aspirations. Everything we sought through the beatings and the blood, through the triumphs and failures, everything we dared to imagine about a new America, a better America, in which each of God's children can live in a society that makes love its highest virtue.
All right, I'm back. We have a lot of time for questions. Well, not a lot, a little bit of time for questions, and we hope to get through as many of them as possible. We actually put out the call for questions far and wide on our Facebook feeds, our Twitter feeds, to teachers and students at area schools, and to all of you as you came in the door. You may have put a question on an index card in the lobby. If so, those will be brought up to me, and I will read as many as I can. If you're just thinking of a question now, there are Vermont Humanities Council staff people in the aisles. They'll hand you an index card, and you're welcome to write down a question and give it back to them, and they'll bring it up here. But I'm going to start with a couple of the questions that we got through Facebook and Twitter. Anna Van from Essex Junction asks, what would you say is the most important aspect that the graphic novel medium has contributed to your story, as opposed to traditional text?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question.
Do you want to respond, young man?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest difference between comics and anything else is that you're not constrained by a budget like you would be on film and television, but you're also not constrained by the perspective like you would be in a documentary. So it's scenes like in book 2, where you have the young child gouging out the eyes of the freedom rider. And you could only show that scene and bring the emotional climax and shock that it brings you in a graphic novel. And I think when you look at the context of comics in the modern era, where young people are reading things on the internet as sequential narratives, right? They're digital natives, they grow up on the internet, they speak in words and pictures, right? If you're going to hit those notes and bring those feelings out in this generation, you have to do it through that method, because that's how they've grown up experiencing these emotions.
Thanks. Beth Thompson from Danby and Castleton University asks, if you can you please talk about the importance of your spiritual beliefs in being able to carry out the daunting task of nonviolent civil disobedience? How can today's activists, who are often atheological, find a similar common core to apply to their nonviolent dissent?
As a young child growing up in rural Alabama, I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. I grew up raising chickens and getting my brothers and sisters and my first cousins all together, along with the chickens. And I would preach. And I think some of my brothers and sisters and first cousins got a little restless, but the chicken paid a great deal of attention. And to be very plain and honest, sometimes since I've been in the Congress, I think some of the chickens tended to listen to me much better Then some of my colleagues listen to me today. It's one thing I like what Andrew did in his whole concept in the graphic novel, we call it. It make it real, it make it plain. When I first moved to Atlanta in 1963, 23 years old, I became a member of Dr. King's church. And he would be preaching sometime, and his father would be in the pulpit or in the audience. And he would say, son, make it plain, make it plain. And I think the graphic novel, March, book 1, book 2, book 3, make it plain. You can feel it. You can almost taste what is happening. Seeing people beating people, spitting on people, and people not fighting back, but taking the blows. Making their bodies become a nonviolent tool to help educate, to help lead people, or to inspire people to lead.
Let's just add that for me as a cultural Catholic, that story really of the chickens really resonated with me as one of my favorite saints was always St. Francis. And St. Francis was, of course, known for preaching to the birds, but he was also known for his work for the poor. And I wonder if there's a parallel in that story, not that you're claiming to be a saint, but it does seem to me like there's some real lessons to be learned about preaching to the birds. One of the students from Middlebury College asked a related question, that March talks about moments like Dr. Martin Luther King's radio sermon, Jim Lawson's sermon, and your time in college that acted as your calling to the civil rights movement. Would you say that there was a specific day or action that acted as your calling, or was it a collection of these happenings? And related to that, was there a moment when you realized you were part of this movement?
Now, growing up only a short distance from Montgomery, I would listen to Dr. King speaking by way of radio, and he would say from time to time, I'm not just concerned about the over yonder, but I'm concerned about the here and now. The streets of Montgomery, the streets of Birmingham, the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. He wanted to make things real, and it inspired, as a seminary student, inspired me to be somebody to go out and preach the good news, that we couldn't wait till the over yonder. We had to follow the teaching of Jesus, but also the teaching of Gandhi.
Dina Du Bois of Corinth asks, thank you both for coming to Vermont. We've been reading March all year. What actions do you think Vermonters should take after reading this graphic novel?
First of all, I would say you have good leaders, unbelievable leaders in the United States, Senate, and in the House, their friends, their brothers. Continue to support them. We need their leadership now more than ever before. Sometimes I worry about the future of our country. We have to save it, save democracy, save the Constitution.
Well, and if I might add, one of the things that I know Senator Leahy does already that I've started doing in my capacity as a writer is I like to visit incarcerated youth. We do reading programs in the prisons. And Congressman Lewis has come with me on several occasions, and we do this all over the country. And I think all of us have an opportunity to volunteer in that capacity. These are people in our community who are oftentimes totally left out and forgotten, and in many cases are in jail because of circumstances beyond their control. And I think for me, especially when I go visit the incarcerated youth. We went to, Cook County, and they performed this unbelievable musical that they'd written and directed. They needed creative outlets, and knowing that people care, right? I mean, that comes down to the fundamental human need to know that people care about each other, right? And if there's any underlying message for March, it is that we will survive anything if we love each other as a community. And I think that includes, and at its most important, we cannot let it exclude any member of our society, and I think that means remembering those who are incarcerated and going and participating.
Rebecca Ashford from Heinsberg, teacher at the Allenbrook School, notes that you wrote, Congressman Lewis, "Our future is in the hands of the young. One generation hands off to the next, and each new generation has its own vision, its own ideals, and its own beliefs. My students," Rebecca says, "often ask questions that I am not able to answer. What advice would you give to young people to stay hopeful and to help shape their beliefs in order to become leaders in the future?"
My advice to young people: to study, learn all that you can. Read everything. To be hopeful, be optimistic, and never, ever get lost in a sea of despair. And when you see something, as I was trying to say earlier, that is not right, not fair, not just, go out there and do something about it. And recruit your friend, recruit your mother and your father, your grandparents and great-grandparents to become part of the effort. I truly believe that it's going to be the youth of America, going to be the children that save us. That save us.
I think for young people today, the internet has made us so sensitized to being abnormal that we'll be mocked or ridiculed or in some way humiliated. And I think if there's any lesson that I've taken from March, it's that you can't be afraid to be laughed at. I spent so many years in the course of March either being laughed out of rooms, being laughed at by people for my ideas. I'll never forget, the congressman, we got invited to go to the New York Federal Reserve to talk about March because they were kind of curious about what this thing was. And they were really just excited John Lewis would come, and Nate and I were brought along as...
Don't say that about yourself.
I appreciate that. I do. But I'll never forget saying in that room, I believe March should be taught in every school in America. And the room doubled over like I had made the funniest joke. All these economists and very serious people at the New York Federal Reserve laughing at us. And it was less than a year later that New York City public schools adopted March system-wide. And I think what I've learned from John Lewis and I've learned from studying the movement is that people who have ideas that are not the status quo, it makes people uncomfortable. And when people are uncomfortable, they lash out, whether it's mocking you, attacking you, whatever their emotional response is. You got to prepare for that. But don't ever let it stop you from questioning the status quo. Don't ever let it stop you from asking why something is the way it is, because that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. That's my 2 cents.
I think I'm going to follow that one up with one from the audience. Elizabeth Kibarinka is here tonight. She's 10 years old. And she says, "Do you think that if nobody tried to stop racism back then, that white people would try to stop it themselves? Or that I would even be alive today to ask this question?"
Andrew, I think you should take it.
No, I mean, I think if my experience has taught me anything, it's that there are few people willing to be the unmoved mover, to quote Plato and his idea of who God is. And I honestly think her question is the right one. I mean, I think there is the possibility that she wouldn't. But I think the closest, to go back to our discussion about religion as well, in these movements, the closest we can come to being with God, to being with a higher power, is to be that person who refuses to accept something that everyone else does. And I think she may be right, but I think what we can take from that question and what we can take from her lesson is that we can't let her be right in the future. We have to be that unmoved mover for the power of justice and for the right things, for the right ideas. Is that okay?
That's okay, son.
Here's a question looking forward to the future from the audience. What do you think racial and immigrant relations will look like in 2050?
Well, it is my hope and it's my belief that in 2050 we'll be much further down that road in creating the beloved community, in redeeming the soul of America. We cannot stand still. We're not going back. We're going to go forward and create one America. I don't think we have a choice. And maybe, just maybe, we can advance as a major lesson for the rest of the planet.
I have a lot of strong feelings about the way we treat immigrants in this country. But I think by 2050, we're going to face two tailwinds. We're going to have two tailwinds. One, we're all going to be a little bit browner, right? Our whole country, whether you look at the birth rate or whether you look at the fact that, the old barriers of like groups of people marrying, it's just not what this generation is. My mother married a Turk. My mother was a white lady from the South. I mean, it's changing fundamentally. But then there's the economic argument. Just to go policy for a while, whip out that Georgetown education here for a second. There's not going to be borders in the traditional sense. That's what they're fighting back on. This is an information economy. A good idea in America is a good idea in China, is a good idea in South America, is a good idea in Africa. And if we are going to be competitive as a country, the idea that we would let anybody go somewhere else because we don't like where they're from, or we have some arbitrary, let's just say it, racist reason, well, that's just stupid. That's going to hurt all of us.
I'm going to keep it
Yeah, I'm off my
kid-focused.
soapbox. I'm good.
I'm going to keep it kid-focused. This is from Zoe Kennedy. She's actually not really a kid. She's 19 years old. She's a UVM class of 22. The environmental movement, like the civil rights movement, is currently being led by youth. However, the environmental leaders are children in their teens. Why do you think this is? And do you see it as a potential problem going forward?
Oh, I don't see it as a problem. I see it as a great sign of our future. There's great hope in these children and these young people. They're saying, I want a planet. I want a society. I'm going to be growing up. I want to live in it. And I think they are inspiring people around the world that we must save this little piece for all the God children, not just for some of us, but for all of us. It would be the children that will help get us there. I think it's not to put down the guys, the men, but I think the women and the children are going to do more to get us there.
We'll do a couple more, but I wanted to just say a couple of things before we wrap it up. After the Congressman and Andrew answer the last couple of questions, they are going to be leaving the stage this way and going up that aisle to get to the book signing in the Amy Tarrant Gallery. And it would be very helpful if y'all would stay seated while they go up the aisle and go out the front doors. I know they would appreciate it very, very much. They're happy to sign your copies of March or the whole trilogy, and they'll still be on sale at the Bear Pond Books table. Thanks for our local bookseller for selling the books. But I'll ask just a couple more questions. I have one from Jaden from Williston. Jaden is a 13-year-old activist. Jaden notes that sometimes adults are mean. You can relate. Jaden says, I've marched with BLM, I've knelt at basketball games, I've attended ACLU meetings. How do you deal with the fear?
You may be afraid, but courage is the ability to go on in spite of fear. You may get knocked down, you may give a little blood, but you get up, you keep pushing, and continue to be hopeful and optimistic that somehow, in some way, you're going to have a victory. You have to believe that. You have to be deeply embedded in your essence that you're going to have a victory. You may suffer a little, get arrested, and go to jail. But keep pushing, keep pulling, and never give up. Never give up.
I've heard you say that a lot, and it always makes me feel something special inside. But there's also a part of this where there's a practical element. And I've watched you, and you never talk about this, but it's something I've tried to live my life by, which is that you have daily routines. You have things that you use to cope with, right? For me, it's that I'll get up every morning and I'll run. It's basically, we're fundamentally talking about emotional control, right? How do you regulate yourself to be able to survive all of this? It's an endurance race. What do you say? This is not a struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. And fear is just one of those emotions that you have to keep in check. And for me, it's things like, and this is going to sound so simple and overly obvious, but it's like, I exercise every morning just to be able to clear out everything and be ready and prepared. You drink water instead of soda. You watch your sugar. It's like I know I can't say that in the maple syrup capital of the world, but like, it's real. I mean, and that's the thing, like during the movement, the more I studied you guys, the more I realized you were doing that. It was prayer, it was meditation, what they would call mindfulness today. And it really comes down to, can you discipline yourself to be able to do that day in and day out? And you build that habit first to then be able to control that fear and those emotions.
Well, Andrew, we had what we call role playing.
Right.
Playing role. You may call it social drama. Mm-hmm. But it strengthened us, made us stronger. And we had music. You've heard me say from time to time, without music, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. It created this sense of solidarity. So today you see, in spite of my age, you see me dancing to a certain song.
You got moves.
Well, it's not moves. You just have to go with it.
But that comes back to our conversation earlier about laughter.
Oh, yeah.
And that you always find a way to see humor. Even it's okay, so here's a staff moment, right? We will all be just freaking out. Somebody just attacked us, something will happen. A lot of times, like the calls will be coming into the office and people are shrieking at us. You want to talk about adults being mean? Try and pick up a congressional phone after a Fox News story. Like, and you will find a way to both make the interns, who are oftentimes, I mean, you want to talk about people holding fear, right? Letting down John Lewis and also confronting these types of folks. You will find a way to make them laugh. You will go, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. And that's self-preservation. You used to tell me stories about Dr. King doing this, you would call it when he was clowning on you. And that he would just be cracking jokes all the time. And I think that's something where there's a reason why in this environment we're turning to comedians to help us understand our politics. Mm-hmm. Because it's the only way we can understand this national trauma we're going through.
I'm going to ask one last question from a member of the audience. What is the Edmund Pettus Bridge of this time?
Oh, there's so many Edmund Pettus bridges all across America, all over. Well, I hate to say it. I don't know how to say it, and you're going to get in trouble.
Good trouble. Let it be good trouble.
But I think when you look at the White House today, it is the bridge.
Congressman Andrew, we are so thankful for you coming to Vermont. We really appreciate it. Before you leave the stage, we would like to present you both with a token of our appreciation. I have maple syrup. That is not what I'm handing you here. I'm going to give you both a copy of Vermont Reads 2020, The Hate You Give, and a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.